Prior to 1696, the English Royal African Company had a monopoly on all English colonists' participation in the Atlantic slave trade. But New Englanders began sending slave ships as soon as the monopoly was lifted, right? So the crown said who could participate, and basically they said we can participate. When that's lifted in 1696, you see a plethora of merchants and investors and groups of folks investing in the slave trade from New England. So New Englanders began sending slave ships as soon as the monopoly was lifted. These voyages grew increasingly common and profitable, and in fewer than 30 years, Rhode Islanders dominated the North American trade in slaves. The slave trade evolved into one of the pillars of the local economy. The vast majority of the slave ships that embarked from British North America left from a port in Newport or Providence, even though it was the smallest and least populated colony. During the colonial period in total, Rhode Islanders sent some 514 slave ships to the coast of West Africa, while the rest of the North American colonists combined sent 189. So 514 compared to 189 of all the other colonists in North America. After the Revolution, Bristol became the primary slave trading port. And in 20 years, between 1787 and 1807, Rhode Islanders transported some 45,230 Africans to bondage, only about 1,000 fewer than they had in the previous 70 years. As historian Jay Cottrey argued, the North American trade in slaves was essentially the Rhode Island slave trade. You're wondering where these really specific numbers are coming from? They're coming from the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, which was put together by a group of historians in the 1990s. It started off as a CD-ROM. Now, if you go to Google and just type slave voyages, it'll come up, the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. And this Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, again, you can go to Google and go slave voyages and it'll come up, has over 36,000 documents of the trade. So primary documents from the period: insurance records, investor records, ship manifest, captain's logs, letters from sailors, right? So these are where these specific numbers come from. So historians gathered all of this information from all over the world, from Liverpool to what is now Ghana and Singambia, to New York, to now what is now Rhode Island, right? And put all of this information in a central place and try to begin to make sense of it. And then statisticians and mathematicians gave us the models. So that's where these very specific numbers are coming from. I want to spend a little bit more time on numbers and just fleshing things out. So when we're talking about the population of enslaved people in Rhode Island, we're actually talking about relatively small numbers, especially if we compare them to the Southern colonies, but relatively high numbers when you put Rhode Island in the context of New England. And then when you're thinking about spaces within Rhode Island, you have places where, you know, every fourth, fifth person you met lived in lifelong hereditary race-based bondage. Right? And so just want to give you a sense of context where Rhode Island is falling in terms of numbers of people and percentage of the population, and where enslaved people are clustered. The free Black population in Rhode Island explodes after the Revolutionary War. This is in response to what enslaved people do themselves. They flee, right? They bargain for their freedom. They demand for their freedom. They petition. They serve in the Rhode Island First, right? That nearly all Black revolutionary regiment, right? And so there's all kinds of ways that they become free. Right? And that is true in Rhode Island and throughout the northern colonies. There was enough space, enough political space in the North for Black people to successfully begin to tear at the institution of slavery in a way that wasn't possible in the southern colonies. Because in the North, what was most important was the business of slavery. And in the South, what was most important was the labor of enslaved people. So it's not to say that the labor of enslaved people in the North wasn't important, it was. But what was most important was the business of slavery. So Northerners could wean themselves off of race-based slavery and still benefit from the institution of slavery, because what they were most invested in was the business of slavery, not the labor of enslaved people. And so now I'm going to turn to enslaved people. The economies of the business of slavery often obscure human experience. Lived experiences can be easily forgotten in a cadre of maps and graphs and tables. And it's paramount that we include the lived experience of enslaved people who labored in the economy of slavery. Their stories are critical to a full accounting of the history and legacies of slavery and capitalism. On August 12th, 1766, Caesar London, the enslaved business agent of Rhode Island Governor Josiah London, recorded the contents of a rather elaborate cookout held by several enslaved people, right? So enslaved people aren't just used for brute labor. Their intellects are exploited. That's what made slavery so profitable. They were people, right? So you could teach them to be the business agent. You could teach them geometry. They could be your secretary. That's why enslaved people were so valuable, because they were intelligent and versatile. So their intellects are exploited as well as their physical strength. Boston Vos, Lingo Stevens, Phyllis London, Neptune Sipton and wife, Princeton Thurston, Caesar London, and Sarah Searing left Newport and went to Portsmouth, for a day in the country. They took, and I quote, a pig to roast, wine, rum, bread, green corn, limes for punch, sugar, butter, tea, and coffee. These friends were asserting their humanity in an inhumane institution. Yes, they were legally recognized as property, but they also took time for themselves. 2 months after the outing, Caesar London and Sarah Searing were married. A year later, Lingo Stevens and Phyllis London became man and wife. I'm always torn when I share this document, because sometimes people look at this document and go, slavery wasn't that bad. People were going out for picnics and enjoying themselves and having tea and rum and coffee and a pig to roast. Slavery in the North, like slavery in the South, rested upon force and violence. There was no good slavery, and benevolent slavery did not exist. You do not rob someone of their freedom every hour of every day nicely. The two just don't hold. But I show this document because it shows the agency of enslaved people. Now, Caesar London was in a very unique position. Most enslaved people were not the business agent of a Rhode Island governor or of any governor or any official, right? And so what London is doing is pocketing the money that he gets to hire an assistant basically, and is using an enslaved person instead, right? And so Caesar London is in a very unique position. The governor wants to keep him relatively content, even though he's not content in slavery, right? And so he allows him these little privileges. And Caesar London takes these little privileges to do something really, really important and really human. Take his friends for a day in the country. This is not frivolous. Enslaved people in the North lived in the households of their enslavers. They were under constant surveillance. And the few records that they tell us how horrible this was.